What happens when the world turns against a U.S. president? At the same time? That's exactly what unfolded when Donald Trump declared what he called Liberation Day. But instead of freeing America, it triggered a chain reaction that would leave Washington scrambling. Trump's bold move? Slapping a 25% tariff on imported steel, aluminum, and cars, with Canada as a prime target.
China, 67%. European Union, 39%. Vietnam, 90%. Taiwan, 64%. We're going to charge them 32%. Japan, 46%. They would charge us 46%. India, very, very tough. Very, very tough. They charge us 52%. Switzerland, 61% to 31%. Indonesia, Malaysia, Cambodia. Oh, look at Cambodia, 97%. United Kingdom, 10%. South Africa, 60%, 30%. And Brazil, 10%, 10%. Bangladesh is 74%. So you see what's going on. Pakistan, 58%. Sri Lanka, 88%. So what we're doing is we're taking not the full, we could take the full 88%. Thanks a lot.
The message was clear. America would no longer depend on foreign manufacturing. But the world saw something else entirely. To Canada, this wasn't policy. It was an ambush. For decades, the U.S. and Canada shared one of the most tightly woven trade relationships in the world, especially in the auto industry. A single car made in Detroit might contain hundreds of parts sourced from Ontario. Their economies were practically stitched together. So when Trump tried to sever that tie, it wasn't just Canada that felt the shock. He was slicing into America's own industrial lifeline. But here's the twist. This wasn't about economic logic. It was about symbolism. Trump's real message was political. We won't be exploited anymore. That rhetoric played well with his base. But it alienated longtime allies who had stood shoulder to shoulder with the U.S. in war, trade, and diplomacy.
As a result of these colossal trade barriers, 81% of the cars in South Korea are made in South Korea. 94% of the cars in Japan are made in Japan. Toyota sells 1 million foreign-made automobiles into the United States, and General Motors sells almost none. Ford sells very little. None of our companies are allowed to go into other countries. And I say that, friend and foe. And in many cases, the friend is worse than the foe in terms of trade. But such horrendous imbalances have devastated our industrial base and put our national security at risk. I don't blame these other countries at all for this calamity. I blame former presidents and past leaders who weren't doing their job. They let it happen, and they let it happen to an extent that nobody can even believe. That's why, effective at midnight, we will impose a 25% tariff on all foreign-made automobiles.
Canada didn't stay silent. Former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau fired back immediately. If the tariffs weren't lifted, Canada would strike with their own 25% tax, this time targeting over $105 billion in U.S. exports. From ketchup to whiskey, nothing was safe. And Ottawa's tone? Unapologetically firm. We are partners, they said. Not pawns. But that wasn't the whole story. Trump didn't stop with tariffs. What came next was an insult no Canadian would forget. And it set the stage for one of the deepest diplomatic rifts in modern U.S. Canada history. Tariffs can bruise an economy, but words, they can break trust forever. Just when tensions were already boiling, Trump poured gasoline on the fire. Instead of dialing things back, he did the unthinkable.
President Trump has just announced a series of measures that are going to fundamentally change the international trading system. Now, in doing so, he has preserved a number of important elements of our relationship, the commercial relationship between Canada and the United States. But the fentanyl tariffs still remain in place, as do the tariffs for steel and aluminum. As of this evening, the tariffs on automobiles will enter into force, and the U.S. has signaled that there will be additional tariffs in so-called strategic sectors, pharmaceuticals, lumber, and semiconductors. So we're in a situation where there is going to be an impact on the U.S. economy, which will build with time. In our judgment, it will be negative on the U.S. economy. That will have an impact on us. But the series of measures will directly affect millions of Canadians. We are going to fight these tariffs with countermeasures. We are going to protect our workers, and we are going to build the strongest economy in the G7. In a crisis, it's important to come together, and it's essential to act with purpose and with force, and that's what we will do.
In a public interview, asked about Canada's reaction, he shrugged and said, "I think he's a good governor." That one word, governor, landed like a slap. It wasn't just a slip of the tongue. It implied that Canada wasn't a sovereign nation, but just another U.S. state. To millions of Canadians, it was deeply insulting and dangerously arrogant. This wasn't diplomacy. It was humiliation. And the response came fast. Canadians, veterans, politicians, average citizens erupted. Hashtags like Nadwak member state trended across Canadian social media. Provincial leaders from British Columbia to Newfoundland issued rare bipartisan statements condemning the remarks. Even those who typically stayed quiet on foreign policy couldn't bite their tongues. One official put it bluntly, "This feels less like trade policy and more like imperialism with a Twitter account." And it wasn't just about wounded pride. These comments reopened old wounds, of wars fought together, of sacrifices made side by side. For many Canadians, it felt like betrayal from a friend they'd trusted for generations. And the consequences weren't just emotional, they were economic. Experts warned the tariffs could raise the cost of a U.S.-made vehicle by $3,000, and Canadian imports by up to $6,000. Car manufacturers panicked, consumers braced, and the S&P 500 dipped 2% overnight. If Canada, America's oldest ally, could be treated like this, who was next? Even conservatives in Canada, usually pro-U.S., began to rethink the alliance. Prime Minister Mark Carney, stepping into Trudeau's shoes, stood before Parliament and said what no Canadian leader had said in decades. "We once stood beside America to protect the free world. Today, we must protect ourselves from a government that's chosen to walk away from everything we built together." The chamber erupted in applause from both sides of the aisle. But this was just the beginning. Canada's anger was no longer just words. The next move? It would hit where it hurts most, at the heart of Trump's economic brand. Canada wasn't just angry, it was strategic. And its first target? Elon Musk. Just days after Trump's 25% tariffs hit Canadian imports, Canada hit back. Not with tweets, but with cold, calculated policy. Their target wasn't the White House, it was Tesla. Out of nowhere, Canada's Ministry of Transport yanked Tesla from its electric vehicle subsidy list. In an instant, Tesla lost access to over $43 million in tax rebates. Even more damaging, the government froze Tesla's tax refund requests and launched a sweeping investigation publicly.
You know what? $155 billion worth of tariffs against the U.S. And you saw the U.S. markets tanking, and you saw also potentially the price of gas going up.
The excuse was bureaucratic. Tesla had reportedly sold over 8,700 vehicles in a single weekend, suspiciously high numbers that hinted at policy loophole abuse. Privately, everyone knew the real message. Canada was done funding U.S. companies tied to Trump. Because this wasn't just about EVs. Tesla is personal. Elon Musk, often dubbed Trump's unofficial advisor, has publicly supported Trump's protectionist trade moves. He's also been critical of Canada's regulatory environment. So, when Canada fired this shot, the world noticed. No need to name Trump. The signal was loud and clear. We won't use Canadian taxpayer money to reward companies cozy with an administration that punishes us. And here's the twist. Tesla was already vulnerable. Facing brutal EV competition from China, slipping market share in Europe, and a growing PR problem over data privacy, Tesla couldn't afford a reputational hit from a U.S. ally. Tesla pushed back, saying it followed the rules and didn't exploit any loopholes. But Canada wasn't budging. The investigation remained open. Payments stayed frozen. No guarantees were given. And something unexpected happened. Canadians cheered. Environmental groups, consumer advocates, even local business leaders came out in support of the government's move. This wasn't seen as petty retaliation. It was viewed as a long-overdue reset, and for political observers, it was a brilliant pivot. Canada didn't retaliate with chaos or chest-thumping. They found a soft spot in the Trump brand and pressed hard. But that strike on Tesla was just the first domino. Because what happened next didn't come from Parliament. It came from provinces, one by one, launching their own countermeasures. What happens when an entire country fights back? Province by province. In Canada, federal retaliation against Trump's tariffs was just the beginning. The real wave came from the ground up. It started in British Columbia. Premier David Eby didn't mince words. We won't sit idle while our economy is under attack. Within days, BC proposed toll fees on American freight trucks passing through to Alaska, impacting over $720 million in goods annually. And that wasn't all. The province banned imports of wine and liquor from Republican-led U.S. states like California, Texas, and Florida. This wasn't just about money. It was political pressure, deliberately aimed at Trump's allies. Other provinces followed suit, each sharpening their own blade. In Nova Scotia, American companies were banned from bidding on public projects. Road tolls for U.S. trucks doubled overnight. Alberta, a province rich in oil, warned it would pull out of long-term energy deals with U.S. firms. Instead, they encouraged exporters to pivot to Europe and Asia. But here's the clever part. None of this felt like chaos. It was organized, legal, and backed by a rare national consensus. For the first time in decades, local leaders from coast to coast were united, not just to defend their economy, but their national dignity. The federal government didn't just approve, it encouraged them. Prime Minister Mark Carney stood before Parliament and delivered a line that would echo far beyond Canada. We are a peaceful nation, but we are not a weak one. Soon after, Ottawa unleashed its own hammer, an official 25% tariff on over $107 billion in American goods. Steel, aluminum, agriculture, consumer tech. No category was safe. Finance Minister Dominic LeBlanc added, "We don't want a trade war, but we won't run from one either." And it didn't stop at taxes. Consumer groups began pushing to audit all US-based companies receiving Canadian subsidies. Public opinion shifted toward building homegrown industries. Retailers started showcasing Buy Canadian campaigns with urgency not seen since the 1980s. What began as a response to Trump's trade policy had now evolved into something much bigger, a national reckoning on economic independence. But even that wasn't the full picture. Because behind the scenes, Ottawa was quietly building something far more permanent, a new economy designed to survive without America. What happens when your biggest trading partner becomes your biggest liability? That's the question Canada finally faced head-on. And this time, they didn't just react, they restructured. For decades, Canada leaned heavily on the U.S. market. Nearly 80% of its exports went south: cars, steel, lumber, energy, even tech. The integration was so deep, some economists called Canada the 51st state in disguise. But Trump's tariffs exposed the harsh truth. That kind of dependence wasn't just risky, it was dangerous. So Canada flipped the script. Prime Minister Mark Carney addressed Parliament with a statement that marked a turning point. We cannot build our future around a partner who could turn away at any moment. From that moment on, Canada's economy would no longer orbit Washington. Instead, it would pivot globally with bold, lasting moves. First, the government fast-tracked underutilized trade deals. Two stood out: the CPTPP, a massive Pacific partnership including Japan, Vietnam, and Australia, CETA, a broad economic pact with Europe. Through those, Canada ramped up exports of food, lumber, minerals, and energy. And for the first time, its clean tech, biotech, and pharma sectors gained real ground in European markets. Next came a surge of investment into domestic industries. Billions were funneled into clean energy, electric vehicle batteries, AI, semiconductors, and smart agriculture. These weren't token gestures. They were strategic bets. The goal? Create industries that Canada could control from start to finish, no longer at the mercy of U.S. demand or supply chains. And it wasn't just about the economy. Defense got a makeover too. Canada began reshaping its national security posture, cutting reliance on U.S.-led NATO systems. New defense tech partnerships were struck with France, Germany, and Sweden. Domestic companies like CAE and General Dynamics were suddenly hiring, expanding, innovating. Then came the soft power play, a nationwide PR campaign launched across international media. Canada, independent, reliable, open. This wasn't just branding. It was a message to investors, allies, and global markets. We're not America's shadow anymore. We're our own pole in a shifting world. And here's the twist. All of this, trade, industry, defense, diplomacy, wasn't about punishing the U.S. It was about preparing for a world where America might no longer lead. But while Canada was building bridges, another storm was brewing. One that could shake the global financial order. What if the world stopped using the U.S. dollar altogether? That's not a theory anymore. It's a movement, and it's gaining speed. While Canada was restructuring its economy, another quiet revolution was unfolding overseas. This time, it wasn't one country pushing back against Washington. It was an entire alliance. Enter BRICS: Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. Once dismissed as an economic talking point, they're now leading a real challenge to America's financial dominance. And the weapon? De-dollarization. For decades, the U.S. dollar has been the king of global trade. Nations stored it. Businesses used it. Banks trusted it. But that dominance came with strings attached. Political leverage that Washington used to impose sanctions, control banking systems, and steer policy worldwide. Now, that grip is slipping. Russia and China have already shifted over 90% of their trade into local currencies, ruble and yuan. India is buying Russian oil with rupees. Even new BRICS members like Egypt, Iran, and the UAE are experimenting with non-dollar payments. And here's the shocker. As of 2023, the dollar's share in global reserves fell below 60%, down from over 70% just 2 decades ago. That drop isn't just symbolic. It's a red flag. The world isn't waiting for permission anymore. Washington's response? Trump's most aggressive tariff plan yet. He announced a 150% tariff on all imports from BRICS countries that refused to use the dollar in trade. Not 15%, 150.
I want to be clear. Europe will safeguard its economic and national security. But it is important that we strike the right balance. One that places emphasis on the positive tools of economic statecraft, such as trade, investment, innovation and production. We want to avoid a global race to the bottom that is in no one's interest. That has to be our primary focus, even as we prepare for all possible scenarios.
A move so massive, it wasn't just economic, it was political warfare. Use our currency or pay the price. But here's the irony. America tried this before, with China in 2018. It backfired. Beijing didn't blink. They hit back, pulled U.S. agriculture imports, and hurt American farmers so badly that Trump had to bail them out. Now, the battlefield is bigger, and the U.S. is more vulnerable. It relies on China for electronics and semiconductors, Russia for rare materials and energy, India for pharmaceuticals, Brazil for food commodities. This time, a tariff war won't just sting. It could spiral, and yet Trump doubled down. His threat landed more like a dare. But BRICS wasn't intimidated. It was energized. The 150% tariff became a rallying cry, pushing them closer together and accelerating plans for a shared reserve currency. So what's the twist? This isn't just a BRICS versus America fight. It's about the entire world exploring life without a U.S. referee. And the more Washington flexes, the faster that reality comes into focus. But that wasn't the final shock. Because right as markets began to panic, America suffered a symbolic blow in a completely different arena, one that hits at the heart of its global security dominance. When allies start canceling billion-dollar fighter jet deals, something's seriously wrong. Trump's 150% tariff wasn't the only headline rattling Washington. Just as the dust from that announcement was settling, another blow hit, this time from Canada and Portugal. Within 48 hours, both countries backed out of the U.S.-led F-35 fighter jet program, a $19 billion partnership once hailed as a cornerstone of Western defense. The reason? Trust had eroded. Canadian officials didn't sugarcoat it. In blunt terms, they said depending on U.S.-controlled defense systems was no longer a safe strategic option. Portugal echoed the same. America's foreign policy under Trump was simply too unpredictable to build a 30-year military plan around. And this wasn't just a procurement shift. It was a message. For the first time since World War II, U.S. allies were openly questioning Washington's ability to lead a military alliance. The reaction from the Pentagon? Alarmed, but muted. The reality? America's grip on global defense partnerships was slipping, and fast. Canada, meanwhile, moved swiftly toward a new defense path. One top contender, Sweden's Saab Gripen fighter jet, a lighter, cheaper, and crucially, politically neutral alternative. But it wasn't just about hardware. It came with a game-changing offer. Full tech transfer. Build the jets in Canada. Train the pilots in Canada. Keep the data in Canada. Thousands of jobs. Total independence. No strings attached. And while this might seem like a localized decision, it signaled something much bigger. U.S. weapons were no longer seen as the automatic choice. Across Europe, that same mindset was taking hold. New data showed that EU countries had increased defense spending by over 30% between 2021 and 2024. Projects like Real Europe, backed by an $800 billion war chest, aimed to break free from American military reliance, focusing on homegrown weapons, intelligence systems, and defense networks. Even NATO loyalists like Germany and France began exploring regional defense autonomy, something unthinkable just 5 years ago. Meanwhile, Canadian defense firms were suddenly flush with federal backing. Companies like CAE and General Dynamics Canada were expanding, building domestic manufacturing capacity to fill the gap left by the U.S. pullback. And here's the quiet twist. This wasn't just about weapons. It was about leverage. If America could use trade to punish allies, what's stopping it from using defense? Countries didn't want to find out. But even as allies backed away from Washington, something deeper was changing. Not just trade, not just military, the very structure of the global order was beginning to shift, and the U.S. found itself slowly being left out of the room. For over 70 years, America stood at the center of the world. But now, that center is cracking. The tariffs, the insults, the broken alliances. What started as Trump's bold play for leverage has morphed into something far bigger, a global reckoning with the very idea of U.S. leadership. Across the globe, former allies are choosing independence over alignment. Canada once relied on the U.S. for 80% of its trade. Today, it's forging new paths through Europe and the Pacific. Portugal just walked away from one of NATO's flagship military programs. The EU is pumping billions into its own defense and tech sectors, determined to reduce reliance on Silicon Valley and the Pentagon. Africa, Southeast Asia, and Latin America are building new partnerships with China, India, the UAE, and each other. And at the center of it all, BRICS, now more than a bloc, but a challenge to the dollar-dominated US-led world order. So, here's the cold reality. America isn't being overthrown. It's being outgrown. Other nations aren't waiting to be invited to the table anymore. They're building their own. And for the first time in modern history, the U.S. is watching major financial, military, and diplomatic decisions happen without it. Trump's 150% tariff didn't stop BRICS. It accelerated their plans. Talks of a new reserve currency are no longer theoretical. They're logistical. China, Russia, Brazil, and others are creating systems that bypass the dollar entirely. And when central banks around the world quietly shift reserves into gold, euros, and digital currencies, the writing on the wall becomes hard to ignore. This isn't just about Trump. It's about a world waking up to the risks of putting all its trust in one capital, one currency, one system. And here's the final twist. Amid the noise and uncertainty, Canada, a country often seen as quiet, cautious, even compliant, has emerged as an unexpected leader. Not through confrontation, not through dominance, but by making a choice. We'd rather stand on our own feet than be held in place by a handshake that can turn into a fist. That message of sovereignty, dignity, and resilience resonates far beyond Ottawa. Because the real question now isn't if a new world order is coming. It's who gets a seat at the table and who gets left behind.